speak up, we have to mobilize, we have to create a constituency of conscience, an international constituency of conscience. My own experience has taught me that countries like the former Soviet Union and Russia, while they appear to be while they are violative of human rights and appear to be indifferent to public opinion, they do care about their perceived legitimacy. And therefore, what needs to do is to expose and unmask that veneer of legitimacy and expose both the culture of corruption, the culture of criminality, and the culture of impunity. I believe that political leaders care about those things, and therefore we have to do whatever we can on a governmental level, on a parliamentary level, on the level of civil society to be engaged in a sustained mobilization of a constituency of conscience.
But what, for instance, particular things would you remind, for instance, in case of Nataliya Sharansky, in case of Nelson Mandela?
Okay, what I developed in those cases was what I called a 10-point advocacy model. I'm not going to bore or burden you, but the first was to, in fact, go into the human rights violator country, whether it be the Soviet Union, South Africa, and make legal representations in that country. You know, the Soviet Union at the time had one of the most comprehensive bills of rights. And what I did was to try to demonstrate how the Soviet Union was violating its own constitution, not the Canadian or the American, but was violating its own constitution in the Sharansky case, and to point out some 20 major procedural violations and then violations of their own law. And the whole idea was to use another term of Sakharov, the mobilization of shame against the human rights violator. And so we took legal action within the Soviet Union. That was the first point. Go into the human rights violator. Second, use the resources of your own country. My own country aided and assisted me in terms of being able to proceed to bring the case before the Soviet Union. Organize parliaments around the world so you'd have a critical mass of parliamentary advocacy. In the US Congress, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. In Canada, the Helsinki bilateral agreements. When I was expelled from the former Soviet Union in my involvement in the Sharansky case, the then Canadian Foreign Minister, Flora MacDonald, made a point of, I flew to London, I was expelled to London, of holding a press conference here in London to symbolically demonstrate the Canadian government's support for me, because the Soviet Union was referring to me as a criminal consorting with other criminals in the Soviet Union. Then suspended all bilateral Helsinki agreements with the Soviet Union at the time because of their imprisonment of Sharansky and their expulsion of Sharansky's lawyer.
We currently have up to 10 Ukrainian prisoners which are in Russia. There are a few famous cases, like with the Ukrainian pilot Savchenko, but also like there were Ukrainian filmmaker Oleg Sentsov and Alexander Korchenko and the others basically kidnapped from Crimea and now are sentenced for 20 years, for 10 years, taken to Siberia. So what do you think in current environment, you know, when there is no Soviet Union, but there is Putin who is strong and there are different discussions between, there is a bit different position also of the Western countries. It's not anymore Cold War, wherever you think about that. So what do you think could be done now in order to really save and bring back Ukrainian prisoners in Russia?
I was just speaking about this now with Bill Browder. I said there isn't the same mobilization today, or even the same understanding. In those days, somebody like Sharansky was a cause célèbre. Today, people are being imprisoned and regrettably are unfortunately unduly anonymous. Even the Magnitsky name is not known as it should be. I believe that we have to return and use some of the initiatives that we're using. As I'm speaking to you, it's the 40th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act. Russia is in standing violation of that Helsinki Final Act. I don't see it being brought up in the discussions amongst the community of nations, holding them accountable. They are in violation of international human rights agreements and treaties. I don't see them being held accountable in the what I might call the courts of public opinion in that regard. So we need some of the effective mobilization that we had then to focus on the political prisoners and make that a focal point of our bilateral and multilateral relations with Russia. If Russia knows that wherever it goes, it's going to bump into a case in which they're going to be exposed for their human rights violations, then maybe they may do something. But I can give you one example. Gorbachev came to Canada. It was his first trip ever before he became president. And he told the story when I met with him. I said, you know, Sharansky was released 6 months after you became president. What was your involvement? He said, when I came to Canada, it was my first overseas trip. I was a Minister of Agriculture. I came before the Parliamentary Committee in Agriculture in Canada. And all of a sudden they started to ask me questions about this Sharansky. He said, believe me, I never heard of who this Sharansky was. I left the Parliament buildings, there was a big demonstration with regard to Sharansky. I spoke to your Minister of Agriculture in Canada. He didn't talk to me only about agriculture, he talked about Sharansky. So when I became president, I looked up the file. I said, who is this Sharansky? He said, yes, he was a troublemaker. He said, but he wasn't a criminal. He said, and it was costing us to keep him in prison. It was costing us in our political relationship, it was costing us in our economic relationship, so I ordered his release. We have to make it costly for Russia to go ahead and imprison and violate the rights of journalists from Ukraine, from the democratic opposition in Russia and the like.
And when you say we, about whom we are speaking? What this mobilization? Are you speaking about the civil society, the governments?
I'm speaking about we need a mobilization of governments, of parliaments, of civil society. That's what I call a critical mass of advocacy. You know, when Putin was engaged, before the seizure of the Crimea, before the invasion of the Ukraine, in the violation of domestic repression at home in Russia, we were unduly silent. And as I've said and written elsewhere, because we were silent with regard to the domestic repression in Russia, we basically invited Putin to go ahead and feel, well, he can go into the Crimea, he can go into the Ukraine. There won't be a price to pay because there was no price to pay for the domestic repression. The things are linked. We have to both hold him accountable in a sustained way for the domestic repression as well as for the international aggression. I think that people who care about two things, the democracy of the Ukraine and also about holding Russia accountable for its violations of Ukrainian people, both externally and in terms of apprehension of journalists and the like. I think that this is something that has to be the focal point of attention when the OSCE meets, etc. One of the problems we have today is, ironically enough, in a time when you have more media than ever, social media, information overload almost, I know that if I speak to the younger generation today, they don't know who Sharansky is. They don't know. Magnitsky, who should be a household word, is not a household word. The Ukrainians who are in prison are not household words. It's our responsibility to make of their cases as we sought to do, and it's true, it's not the anti-apartheid days when Mandela could be the poster person for the anti-apartheid movement. It's not the Soviet Union when Sharansky could be the poster person for the struggle against human rights violations in the Soviet Union. But I still think that we have to hold Putin to account, because in the situation today, he still emerges. While it's not the former Soviet Union, there's a lot of former KGB methods and conduct that has taken place for which he should be held to account, and regrettably is not held to account. There need not be any contradiction between the protection of security and the protection of human rights. When I was Minister of Justice, I had two foundational principles. The first was that terrorism constitutes an assault on the security of a democracy like France or the UK or Canada or wherever, and on the rights of its citizens, the rights of its citizens to life, liberty, and security of the person. Therefore, anti-terrorism law and policy must be seen as promoting and protecting the security of a democracy and the rights of its citizens. At the same time, and this is the second principle, that anti-terrorism law and policy must always comport with the rule of law, must always adhere to, as in our case, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Minorities must never be singled out for differential and discriminatory treatment. I believe we can both protect security and protect human rights at the same time. My concern is, and I've said this now for years, we are now experiencing the greatest humanitarian catastrophe since the end of the Second World War, with an outflow of refugees and the like, largely anchored in the Syrian tragedy. The problem is we're dealing with the consequences and not the cause. Years ago, we should have invoked the responsibility to protect principle and protected the Syrian civilians. We might not have had the kind of situation of the killing fields that we've seen in Syria, where we have 12.2 forcibly displaced people, close to 5 million refugees. So what we're now seeing is a consequence of not dealing with the cause, and that is the massive killing and displacement in Syria. We need now to do two things. Number one, we need to bring about a ceasefire and stop the killing in Syria. We need to do what we can for the rebuilding of that country, so rather than them creating refugees, people will return to Syria. I know it's a failed state, but that's what we have to try. We have to help the refugees who are in Jordan and in Iraq and Lebanon in a way that they won't feel the need to leave there. And finally, what we need to do is, with respect to refugees that are coming here, we have to, from a humanitarian point of view, be open to the resettlement of refugees. And from a security point of view, we will have to ensure that, in fact, the proper vetting is done so that we don't end up in a situation where the population becomes anti-refugees because they feel these refugees are security risks.